this afternoon, what I want to do, again, there's two things. This is even more grounded in practice. No, not even more. This is more explicitly grounded in some of the research that I did. And so you will hear a little bit more of the voices of people I worked with. But also, again, I want to invite you to think theologically with me. What is it that we are doing? And specifically focusing this afternoon on non or minimally speaking autistic people. This is going to be a challenge. This challenge for me, I don't have all the answers for this. Not at all. I did some work in this area because in research, non or minimally speaking autistic people, if there's a hierarchy, they're at the bottom of the bottom of the bottom. And that's just not good enough. And I know why it is, because it's difficult. How are you going to communicate with these people? How are you going to hear their voices? And that's why researchers generally, well, that's my take on it. Researchers generally probably kind of avoid that for that very reason. And it's methodologically, from a research point of view, there's all kinds of risks and things you shouldn't do or you should do or whatever. I've just tried something, and I'm trying even more in a project that I'm doing now, because that's just not good enough, right? It's just not good enough from simply a research point of view, but also as a Christian doing this work. Jesus went to places where no one wanted to go, right? And I think we are called if we are called to follow Jesus, then that's where we need to go. So anyway, so that's not making myself more spiritual than I am, but that's just saying, like, I think one way that I think of it is that there's an ethical imperative to do this work, and that ethical imperative trumps the methodological risks. So as a researcher, that's how I think about it. Good. Agenda for today then, for this afternoon. I'm going to say a little bit about the state of research. Actually, I said already a little bit about that in the state of the church. Again, autism is, but we are going very quickly through that because we saw that this morning. Then I want to present some of the results that we had in the research that we did with non or minimally speaking autistic people. I'm going to say a little bit about methodology that I used. How can we know what we know if you cannot verbally communicate with people? And then the overarching theme was participation, liturgical and social participation. Then I will offer some theological considerations. Again, the concept of participation is going to be important. We saw some of that this morning already. And brace yourselves, speech act theory. I'm going to say a little bit about that as well. Okay. State of the research and the state of the church. So about 1 to 2% of the population, general population, has a diagnosis of autism. The most recent number that I heard was exactly a couple of hours ago, 1 in 36 people. That seems a high number. I'm not surprised by that. I'm just not surprised by that. But maybe that's too high, I don't know. But say 1 to 2% of the population has a diagnosis. Of that, there's estimates, and it's just estimates, 25 to 35% of autistic people are non or minimally speaking. And of all autistic participants in research, only 2% of those are non or minimally speaking. And actually, there should be maybe a bullet point in between. When you look at autism research, generally, I'm not speaking theology necessarily, just generally, most research does even not include autistic participants themselves. And certainly when it comes to people who also have intellectual disabilities or who are non-speaking or minimally speaking, which is not the same necessarily, usually that research is being done with parents and not with the people themselves. So that's the state of the research. And again, I'm not sure whether the church is much different. So again, we saw that this morning, attendance of religious services is not uncommon, but autistic children are 50 to 70% less likely to be in our churches. Not on the spectrum, if you don't attend religious services, 24%. On the spectrum, 32%. That's a higher percentage. And then compared to, again, autistic people are at the bottom of the statistics. My colleague Grant McCaskill, he wrote one of the first books, or seminal book on autism and the church. That's the title, Autism and the Church. Also with Baylor University Press, also with 20% discount this weekend, right? But no, it's a really, really good book, and it's a much more accessible book than mine. Mine is an academic monograph. That was a deliberate decision. His is written for a wider audience. It's a stellar book. And he says, well, how do you define autism? Because that's where you need to start somehow, just to be on the same page. And this is the way that he thinks of it, and I find it really helpful. He says it's a cluster of characteristics. And so the first cluster would be social interaction and communication. So it's no secret that autistic people and non-autistic people often communicate in different ways from each other. Notice what I'm doing here. Remember normalcy? Okay, so the way I formulated this was autistic and non-autistic people communicate different from each other. I'm not saying autistic people communicate differently, because when I do that, it implies the norm of normalcy again. So do you see what I'm doing there? So I'm trying to do that. So that answers that question that we had this morning, like how can we train ourselves to use certain language? Well, even if it's clunky, that's what we need to do, right? So the use of language, so it's some autistic people have what clinically is called developmental delays in the use of language. Another characteristic under this cluster is the highly precise use of language. So often autistic people will be very precise in the way they use language. There are systematizing tendencies. So this is a picture that I always use. This is an autistic person eating their M&Ms. I just love that. Now, to be clear, you don't need to be autistic in order to sort your M&Ms before you eat them. It's not a symptom, ugly word, it's not a symptom of autism, but, you know, and also not all autistic people will sort their M&Ms in this way before they eat it. So but it's just a nice picture that kind of illustrates the systematizing tendencies. And again, they can be a gift to the church, right? It's great if you see certain patterns, certain systems, how things work, it can be a great gift. And then incredibly important, and some of my research is in this area, the sensory perception. If you want to understand autism, you need to understand sensory input, sensory processing. That is increasingly seen in the research as a key, as a cornerstone for understanding autism. So there you have hypersensitivity, hyposensitivity, sensory seeking, all of that. Okay. So we saw this note, person first versus identity first language. It was picked up in quite some conversations. That was interesting to hear. I want to add something for this presentation, and that is non-verbal versus non-speaking. You will have noticed that I use non-speaking. Why is that? Because in that community, insofar as we can speak about community, the spellers community, for example, they prefer usually non-speaking, because non-verbal implies, so the argument goes that you don't understand language.